The rain began as a fine silver mist that turned the dust of the yard into a slick, dark skin. But by the time the sun had vanished behind the jagged teeth of the western range, it had become a steady, rhythmic drumming against the tin roof of the freight wagon. Inside the cramped space, the air smelled of wet canvas, old cedar, and the sharp, medicinal tang of the liniment Silas was rubbing into the deep purple bruising on Martha's ankle. The only light came from a small shielded lantern hanging from a rib of the wagon cover, its flame shivering slightly with every buffeting gust of wind that rocked the heavy vehicle on its springs. He worked in a silence so thick it seemed to possess its own weight, his large calloused hands moving with a precision that belied their rough appearance. He didn't look at her face, focusing instead on the swollen joint and the way the lamplight caught the weave of her heavy wool stockings. Martha leaned back against a rolled tent fly, her breathing slow and slightly hitched. She watched the top of his head, the way his dark hair, flecked with gray, curled at the nape of his neck. The heat from his palms seeped through her skin, a grounding warmth that made the ache in her leg feel distant, almost secondary to the immediate reality of his presence. They had been on the trail for 3 weeks, 2 strangers hired to move a dead man's estate from one valley to the next, bound together by a contract and the shared necessity of survival. There had been no long gazes across campfire smoke, no soft words whispered under the stars. There had only been the creak of leather, the grit of the road, and the 1,000 small, exhausting tasks that kept a team moving through a landscape that didn't care if they lived or died. Silas finished with the liniment and reached for a strip of clean linen he had torn from a flour sack. He began to wrap the ankle, the fabric white and stark against the dimness of the wagon interior. His fingers brushed the hem of her skirt, a brief accidental contact that neither of them acknowledged with a start or a glance. It was just another texture in a world of textures, the rough canvas, the cold iron of the lantern, the damp heat of the rain-saturated air. "Keep it elevated on the grain sack," Silas said, his voice a low, gravelly resonance that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. Martha shifted her weight, settling her foot onto the burlap. "The grade will be steep tomorrow if the mud doesn't hold." "We'll take it slow," he replied. He didn't move away immediately. He sat on the edge of a wooden crate, his shoulders slumped with a profound, bone-deep tiredness that mirrored her own. Outside, the world was a chaos of water and wind, but inside the wagon there was a strange, fragile equilibrium. The rain hammered a frantic code against the canvas, yet the space between them was quiet, a vacuum of peace carved out of the storm. Silas reached out and adjusted the lantern wick, the small mechanical click of the brass knob loud in the stillness. The light flared briefly, casting his shadow long and distorted against the arched wagon bows, before settling back into a steady, amber glow. He began to clear the small space they shared, folding a discarded blanket with slow, methodical movements. His hands were mapped with the history of a hard life, scars from rope burns, nicks from slips of a knife, the permanent darkening of wood smoke and soil. Martha watched the way he smoothed the fabric, his thumbs tracing the rough hem. She felt a sudden, inexplicable pull of safety, a loosening of the tension she had carried in her chest since they had left the railhead. It wasn't the safety of a protector, it was the safety of a shared burden. They were 2 people who had forgotten how to rest, now finding themselves forced into a stillness they hadn't asked for. Silas stood and moved toward the back of the wagon to check the tie-downs on the tailgate. The wind hissed through the gaps in the canvas, bringing with it the scent of wet sage and ozone. He pulled the puckered opening tight and knotted the rope, his movements rhythmic and certain. When he turned back, he saw Martha had closed her eyes, her head resting against the wooden upright of the wagon frame.
The lamplight softened the lines of her face, erasing the years of hard work and the shadows of whatever life she had left behind in the east. He sat back down, closer this time, his hip brushing against the crate where her good foot rested. He took his pocket knife from his denim trousers and a small piece of cedar he had picked up at the last wood camp. He didn't carve anything particular, just whittled thin, curling shavings that fell into a small pile between his boots. The sound of the blade through the wood was a soft, repetitive hiss that sat beneath the drumming of the rain. "You should try to sleep," Silas said, not looking up from the wood. Martha opened her eyes, her gaze drifting to the pile of cedar shavings. "The rain is too loud for sleep." "It'll turn to a rhythm soon enough, like the wheels." "Maybe." She watched his hands. There was a comfort in the repetition, a domesticity that felt out of place in a freight wagon in the middle of a nameless territory. He wasn't performing for her, he was just being near her. The silence between them wasn't a wall, it was a floor they were both standing on. Silas paused in his whittling and looked at the ankle he had wrapped. He reached out and adjusted the grain sack by a fraction of an inch, ensuring her leg was stable. "Does it throb?" "Less now." He nodded and went back to his wood. The minutes stretched, measured by the shrinking of the cedar block and the steady pulse of the storm. The air in the wagon grew warmer, trapped by the heavy canvas and the heat of their bodies. Martha felt the heaviness of sleep finally beginning to pull at her limbs, a slow motion drowning in the dark. She shifted her position, sliding down until her shoulder pressed against Silas's arm. He didn't flinch or move away. He remained as solid and unmoving as a mountain, his arm a warm, firm presence against her. He shifted his weight slightly to better support her, his movements so subtle they were almost imperceptible. He continued to whittle, the small curls of wood falling softly. The physical closeness was unstudied, a natural extension of the space they occupied. Neither of them spoke of it, neither of them wondered what it meant. It was just the most practical way to exist in the cold, wet dark. As the night deepened, Silas set aside his knife and the cedar block. He blew out the lantern, plunging the wagon into a sudden absolute blackness that made the sound of the rain feel even more intimate. He could hear Martha's breathing change, moving from the shallow hitch of pain to the long, deep draws of heavy sleep. Her head slumped on his shoulder, the weight of it familiar and strange at the same time. He sat in the dark, staring at the invisible wall of the wagon. He could feel the warmth of her neck against his collarbone, the soft scent of her hair, something like lye soap and dry grass. He didn't move to lay down. He stayed sitting up, serving as a pillar for her to lean against, his own eyes growing heavy. He thought about the trail ahead, the mud, the river crossings, and the long miles of dust, but they felt less like obstacles and more like a path they were simply walking together. The rain slackened after midnight, fading to a gentle patter, then a rhythmic dripping from the canvas eaves. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the occasional stomp of a mule tethered outside, or the creak of the wagon as it settled into the softening earth. Silas felt Martha stir in her sleep, her hand moving blindly in the dark until her fingers brushed his forearm. He didn't wake, her hand simply came to rest there, her thumb hooking into the cuff of his sleeve. He covered her hand with his own, his palm broad and warm. He didn't squeeze or grasp, he just let his hand rest there, a quiet confirmation of his presence. He felt the tension leave his own shoulders, a knot he hadn't known was there, finally unraveling. He wasn't Silas, the teamster, the man with a past he didn't talk about. He was just a man in a wagon, keeping a steady place for a woman to rest. The first gray light of the dawn began to seep through the canvas, turning the dark into a pale, ghostly silver. The interior of the wagon began to take shape again, the crates, the sacks of flour, the spilled cedar shavings on the floor. Silas watched the light grow, his back aching from the hours of sitting upright, but he didn't want to move. Martha was still deep in sleep, her face pressed into the rough wool of his coat, her hand still anchored to his sleeve. He looked at their hands in the dawn light, the small, pale fingers against his dark, weathered skin. It was a sight that should have felt significant, but instead it felt ordinary. It felt like the sunrise or the rain or the way the mules knew the road. It was just another part of the day. He realized then, in the quiet gray light, that he didn't want to be anywhere else. He didn't want a different wagon, a different road, or a different life. He just wanted the kettle to boil and the mules to be fed, and for her to wake up and tell him how the ankle felt. Martha moved then, a small sigh escaping her lips. She blinked her eyes open, squinting at the dim silver light. She didn't pull away when she realized she was leaning against him. She stayed there for a long minute, her head on his shoulder, her hand still holding his arm. She looked at their joined hands in the dawn light, her expression unreadable but calm. "The rain stopped," she whispered, her voice thick with sleep. "A while ago," Silas said. He reached out with his free hand and smoothed a stray lock of hair from her forehead. His touch was hesitant, a brief light contact that lasted only a second. She didn't move away. She leaned into the touch for a heartbeat, her eyes closing again. "I slept," she said. "You did. You didn't. I was fine right where I was." She sat up slowly, the movement careful of her ankle. The physical distance between them returned to a few inches, but the atmosphere remained. The silence was comfortable, the quiet ease of two people who had found a rhythm they didn't need to explain. Silas stood up and stretched, his joints popping in the cool morning air. He moved to the back of the wagon and untied the canvas, letting in a flood of crisp, scent-filled light. The world outside was washed clean, the sage a vibrant green, and the mountains to the north capped with a fresh dusting of snow. The mud would be deep, but the air was sweet. Silas looked back at Martha, who was sitting on her crate, her hands folded in her lap, watching him. "Coffee?" he asked. "Coffee," she agreed. He climbed out of the wagon, his boots hitting the soft earth with a muffled thud. He began to gather dry wood from the sheltered box beneath the wagon bed, his movements efficient and practiced. He felt her watching him through the opening in the canvas, a steady, quiet presence that made the labor feel light. He started the fire, the small flames licking at the dry cedar, the scent of the smoke rising into the still air. As the water in the pot began to simmer, he heard her moving inside the wagon, the soft rustle of fabric and the thud of her crutch. She appeared at the tailgate, holding the 2 tin mugs they used. He reached up and helped her down, his hands firm around her waist as he lowered her to the ground. She leaned against the wagon wheel, her weight on her good leg, and handed him the mugs. They stood by the small fire, the steam from the coffee rising in white plumes between them. They didn't talk about the night or the ankle or the road ahead. They just stood in the morning light, the warmth of the coffee seeping into their hands, the quiet crackle of the wood the only sound. Silas looked at her, the way the dawn light caught the hazel in her eyes. He saw the tiredness there, but he also saw a peace that hadn't been there the day before. He felt a sudden sharp pang of something that wasn't quite joy and wasn't quite sorrow, but a heavy, meaningful blend of both. It was the feeling of a man who had finally found a place to stand. "We'll make 10 miles today," he said, blowing on his coffee. "10 is enough," she replied. She took a step toward him, leaning slightly on her crutch, and rested her free hand on his forearm. It was the same place she had held in the dark. She didn't say anything, and she didn't look at him. She just stood there, her hand a warm, steady weight on his arm, watching the fire. Silas didn't move. He didn't pull away or try to turn it into something more. He just stood with her, his heart quiet, his mind clear, as the sun climbed over the rim of the world and turned the mud of the road into a path of shimmering golden light.